Today, we're in for a rare treat. Allow me to introduce our friend and author, speaker, true visionary, and the woman affectionately known as the doyen of death, Gail Ruben. Welcome, Gail. Thank you so much for coming on our first guest speaker podcast.
Great to be with you.
Oh, thank you, Gail. Thank you, Gail. We appreciate it so much. So we just wanted to ask you a few questions today. One of them was, why do you think it's important for families to have open conversations about death?
Well, despite great advances in medical care, we are all going to die. We have a 100% mortality rate. So it's going to happen whether we talk about it or not. And we're better off if we do have conversations. And my motto is just like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead.
Right, right.
Very, very true. So, Gail, what are some of the common fears or misconceptions that keep people from discussing end of life issues with their loved ones?
Well, I think number one is if we talk about it, it's going to happen. And yeah, it's going to happen whether we talk about it or not. So get rid of that misconception right off the bat. And, my husband did die a year after we pre planned our funerals. And thank God we had pre planned because his death after medical complications after prostate surgery um,
Mm.
that didn't cause him to die as a result of pre-planning our funerals. But, as the widow in that case, oh my God, it was such a big help to have already pulled that information together and made our plans and actually paid for them uh, during a really bad time in my life. So going ahead and making those plans didn't make that happen, but it's a big help to have already put them in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Gail, how do you recommend starting the conversation about death, especially with family members who may be resistant or a little uncomfortable?
I am a big fan of using TV or film clips to get people to learn and talk. And my favorite go to is the 1976 Mary Tyler Moore Show episode Chuckles Bites the Dust. It
Wow.
it's hysterical, and it's all about talking about death and talking about funerals, but in a way that makes you laugh. And when you laugh, you get endorphins in your system that can help you relax about a very stress
Right.
inducing topic. And the last scene in the show is they all come back to Mary's apartment after Chuckle's funeral, where Mary has lost it, laughing outrageously because she's been so suppressed during the earlier part of the show about we have to, plan this funeral, where they talk about cremation, burial, um, just park me out there on the curb with my hat on and the trash, which is not legal. But and Ted, of course, says just freeze me. So there's all sorts of options posited there at the very end. So you can watch it. It's less than 30 minutes, and it's available on streaming. And it's a great way to break the ice.
Wow. I've never seen that episode, as many Mary Tyler Moore shows as I've seen. So I'll put that on my list.
You too. We need to put it, we'll put it under references. Chuckles like stuff. Oh my goodness. So thank you, Gail. What topics should families prioritize when having these discussions? For example, healthcare directives, burial preferences, financial planning. What topics do you think we need to talk about most important?
Well, ideally, because if medical emergencies get involved, your advanced medical directives is probably the first thing one should take care of. But, talking about what do you want to do with the body is also important. Uh, Cremation, burial, donation to science. There's a lot of new options opening up with, you can be composted or water cremation, and there's all kinds of choices to make there. But and then of course, yeah, you do want the financial. Probably the big question is, do you have a will? Is most
Right,
basic.
right, right. Well, Gail, how do you balance that addressing of the practical matters like wills and directives with the emotional aspects of actually preparing for death?
I think it requires a certain level of self-esteem to be able to openly and honestly talk about death-related issues, because there are studies that show that only about a third of adults do any end-of-life planning. And I don't know if you guys remember hearing
Jack Canfield?
Jack Canfield. I've heard Jack Canfield cite some study that says that two-thirds of adults have low self-esteem.
Hmm.
So look to your left, look to your right. One of you is good, two of you are in trouble. And I have thought for a very long time that it's the people with good self-esteem, that one third, that are actually going ahead and planning ahead for end of life issues.
Interesting.
If you have low self-esteem, death is very scary and you don't want to talk about it. So I don't know if we can raise everybody's self-esteem, but that might be a good starting point.
Yeah.
It takes a village, right? It takes a village. And our final question today is, how can parents approach the topic of death with younger children or teens in a way that's age appropriate and meaningful?
Boy, I would have to refer you to Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers said, if you can talk about it, you can deal with it. And I would say use specific language, not euphemisms, and just be gentle and maybe ask them questions about their understanding of death.
Yeah.
We
One of
actually
the resources.
I'm sorry, we have a little more time for that last question, don't we, Kathy?
I just was going to, we can cut this out or not, but one of the resources that I have, that I wrote a book, a kid's book on shedding and dealing with grief and loss and death and dying. And it's been put into a lot of the school systems, the Houston school system, the Boston school system, and they're using this in their curriculum. It's true and false questions. Parents and kids talk about it, and teachers and kids talk about it openly, and it's fun, and it's about Lenny the lizard, who went through some loss.
See?
Great resource.
So let me ask you, Gail, what advice do you have for handling disagreements or strong emotions that may arise during some of these discussions?
I would say time out, take a break, postpone it, but come back to it when the emotions aren't running quite so high.
Yeah.
Or maybe try to ask questions about, why are you so upset about this? What is at the root of this?
Yeah. Yeah. Help me understand,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Gail, thank you so much for your answers. They've been wonderful. Can you just share with us where our listeners can get in touch with you if they have any additional questions or want to buy your amazing books because they are amazing?
A goodgoodbye.com is my main website. And you can always email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com. Would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Gail.
Thanks.
Today, we're in for another rare treat. Allow me to introduce our friend and author, speaker, true visionary, and the woman known affectionately as the doyen of death, Gail Ruben. Thank you so much for coming today, Gail. This is our second interview with you, and we're so excited about your contributions.
Yes. Thanks, Gail, for joining us again.
Excited to be with you guys. You are visionaries as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, we want to talk a little bit about conflict after we die. So, one of my questions was, how can you discuss death openly, help prevent family conflict after somebody passes away?
Well, I think it helps to know their thoughts before they die. Uh, you
Good
know,
point. Good point.
having those conversations is much better. Um, I myself, well, I've been in this death business discussion for 15 years now. And my parents were very open to talking about what they wanted, and we got their funerals planned and paid for like 11 years before they died. And that was so very helpful. And they did a trust, and they were always updating it as life changed. And that's very important to do those concrete things that can help avoid conflict after someone dies. And I have to say, myself and my three brothers, thank God, we're all very copacetic. We're very, communicative, and we generally like each other.
That's good.
Yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
And unfortunately, some families are not quite as close as your brothers and you, Gail. So, what are some of the most common sources of family conflict after someone passes away?
Well, part of it is the person who passes away. If they're a cranky, kind of person who has grudges, that's going to pass along conflict to their children or grandchildren. Financial issues are always a source
Yeah.
of conflict for sure, and stuff. And I know we're going to talk a bit about heirlooms, but yeah, if you haven't identified people to receive specific items, that can be a big source of conflict.
Absolutely. How does having a clear and well-communicated will or estate plan reduce the likelihood of those disputes, Gail, among family members?
Well, sure, there's no surprises if you've already, let people know this is, you're disinherited, or which will still cause conflict, I'm sure. But you don't want to surprise people with uneven distribution of assets, or if there is an uneven distribution, to understand the reasoning behind that. And hopefully the various parties involved can say, yes, I understand and agree to that. But yeah, those are some ways to avoid the conflict, is just don't surprise people.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent point.
I know of a family who's because of very poor planning, the woman that lived with this man for 30 years and the the woman that thought she was his daughter but really wasn't. They just forgot to clarify a few things as she was growing up, ended up getting nothing out of a $5 million inheritance. It all went to sisters that he was not planning on giving his money to, and the people that he lived with and loved and was really hoping that would get the income to allow them to continue their life, got nothing because he just forgot to do a will. He was going to do it, but just forgot, and it just had a disastrous consequences. So we sure, I think all of us know of people where that's happened. So how can families discuss inheritance and distribution of assets in a way that feels fair and avoids resentment?
Well, we get back to that kind of self-esteem issue that we talked about in the previous episode. It's you can't wave a magic wand and achieve that kind of easy way of communicating with people. Um, so, maybe the best thing to do is really get an estate attorney involved for the people who are passing on their assets. Uh, Sometimes having that third party who knows what they're talking about and can help the person who is setting up their estate and how they want to pass it along might be the best way to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Well, what steps can people take now to document and communicate their healthcare and their end of life preferences to prevent confusion and disagreements down the road?
So, a lot of advanced medical directive legal forms are not really insightful into the mindset of the person. We had at our Before I Die New Mexico Festival a review of the Five Wishes form,
Right.
which brings more of your thoughts about how you want to be treated at the end of your life. And one of those parts of the Five Wishes was how you physically want to be treated, music, or who do you want to have around or not around. And one of the statements, I love this. I would like to be massaged with warm oils as often as possible. Don't wait until you're dying to get a good massage.
Good point. Good point. And our final question for this episode: how can individuals ensure that sentimental items like heirlooms are distributed in a way that honors family relationships?
You might just want to start distributing those items now.
Yep.
One of the things that I had inherited was a family heirloom, a brass samovar from Russia. And I have no children, so I had no one to pass it on to. And I wound up getting it back to my mom, who it came from her side of the family, and she actually passed it on to a cousin of hers
Mm.
from that side of the family. So yeah, do it now. Pass along those heirlooms while you still can, and try to keep it in the family in a way that makes sense.
Great advice. Do it now.
Do it now.
Otherwise,
Yes.
it would probably end up at a garage sale somewhere and nobody would know the history of it. It would become just a trinket at a garage sale. So rather than a treasured family heirloom.
And we don't want that.
You don't want
Yes.
that. No, no. Well, thank you so much, Gail. And can you tell us where our listeners can reach you? What's the best way to get in contact with you and about your books?
Visit my website, agoodgoodbye.com, and there is the To Die For shopping page. And my books are also available on Amazon. And if you want to get in touch, email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com.
Great, great. One more question for you, Gail, is you mentioned the five wishes. If someone wanted to learn more about that, where would they go?
Uh, I forget their website, but you just do a web
Google.
search for the Five Wishes and you'll get it right away.
So
All
just
right,
Google search. Yep.
great. Thanks so much.
So much. Today, we are in for another rare treat. We have our dear friend, an author, a speaker, true visionary, and the woman known affectionately as a doyen of death, Gail Ruben, here today for a third episode. Gail is just has so much information about death and dying. She's been working in this field for 15 years, and we look up to her as a mentor. So we're so glad to have you here, Gail.
Great to be with you. Every day on this side of the sod is a good day.
Yes.
Well, Gail, we wanted to talk a little bit about distribution of things, and if you can share with us what are the most common mistakes people make in dividing up their assets, and how can that lead to family conflict?
Well, when you're talking about financial stuff, unfair distribution, unequal distribution without explanation, that can lead to conflict. So letting your plans as somebody who's passing along money or goods, let the people you're planning on giving them to know why you're doing it the way you're doing it. Um, and being somebody who disinherits someone else, is kind of like being an SOB from beyond the grave. It's like, fine, be that way, but you're really not being a good person when it comes to that kind of activity with your distribution plans.
Yeah, it can be difficult. I know when my dad died in a car accident about 25 years ago. It was just my sister and I, only two family members left, and her son, Trey. And I was traveling around speaking, and we put the house up for sale. It sold, and now all of a sudden, the house of decades of stuff has to be cleared out, and there's no time. I wasn't not even going to be back. So my sister and I both said, "Is there anything that you want?" And she says, "I want the grandfather clock," and I said, "I'd like my parents' cherry poster bedroom suit." And I said, "Well, all right. Why don't we've had such awesome parents, and we did. Our mom and dad, they just left this earth way too early. Why don't we donate everything in the house to the Tennessee Baptist Children's Home, which is in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and have group homes for children who all their parents are in jail or prison and who've not had very good role models." And my sister said, "That's a great idea." And we both were just so joyful and excited when this big van moving truck came and just took everything in the house. And we thought this is a way that we can honor our parents' legacy, and we can share some of the resources to some children that don't have the best parents.
Well, and it's also, I don't know, the tax code has changed probably since then, but it's also a charitable donation that, you know, goes on that tax return for that year.
And one thing I think we can do is to recommend writing a letter of intent to your family so that you have your will, you have everything divided up, but then you have a special letter that you put in your legacy binder, which we're going to recommend you get together. So it's all in one place, easy place to find a letter of intent, which tells why you're distributing things the way you're distributing things, explains why you're doing that, because it's so interesting. After a death, 75% of people have some sort of conflict after death. And so if you can make it as easy as possible, you're going to prevent a lot of that conflict from happening. So write a letter as to why you're giving one person this and one person that. If there's something it's not equal, talk about maybe someone that took care of you and you're going to be giving a more distribution for that. Mention those things in a letter of intent so everyone is sure it comes from you and you're not getting undue influence from somebody. It's not coming from someone else. It's coming from you. And that makes it so much easier for your family to manage.
Right.
Well, and my friend Gary, who died on hospice, and I was his hospice contact, he was a longtime friend of mine, and he basically didn't care what happened to his stuff. And he had rented a house he was in the same house for like 20 years. And he said, "I don't care what happens to my stuff." He told his sister, "My guitars are probably the most valuable thing I own." So she and her husband took the guitars, and basically we had an open house for Gary's friends and said, "Come and take whatever you want." He had a huge LP collection and people picked through it, but we still had like hundreds of LPs left. So I took those to Goodwill and donated those. And then whatever was left, a service called Junk King came and took away everything else. And boy, did they clear out the house. They even cleared out the refrigerator. So that can be a real blessing for people who have stuff that, what am I going to do with it? Yeah.
We had a big boathouse. My husband and I were going to retire up on our beautiful lake cabin on the lake. And then he died, and I didn't want to be up there all by myself. So we had to get rid of it. But before he died, my daughter and her husband told us that we could not die until we got that boathouse cleaned out, because we built a great big boathouse and filled it with the stuff from our other house. And within the boathouse, it was, it was pretty full. And of course, my husband died. He didn't listen to them. He died anyway. So I was the one who had to get that cleaned out, and I didn't have to do it alone, because I probably would have never sold it. I would have just been frozen with even the thought of trying to clear that out.
Right.
And I got a company called Simplify Wealth that came, and they just came in and they cleared everything out. All the things like the garden chemicals and so on, they had those disposed of properly. They knew all of the details about disposing of things far better than I did. And yes, it did cost a little bit of money, but you know what? I sold the cabin and I just pretended in my own mind I sold it for less and just used that money to pay them off. And it was the best money I ever spent in my life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Great.
are there any other strategies you can think of to help when dividing sentimental items like family heirlooms or keepsakes to ensure everyone feels respected?
I experienced with my in-laws, they had, an apartment full of stuff. And my brother-in-law and I went through, and he really didn't want to save much of anything. I wound up with the photo albums for my in-laws. It's like, I'm not even related to these people. So I tried to be, I went through the albums. I pulled out some nice photos that I thought maybe my brother-in-law might like, or a few other family friends. But boy, photo albums are tough for other people's families. It's like, I'm not even related except by marriage to these people. So but there are ways you can go through and pick out just a few special photos and keep whatever you want and share with others. Um, it helps build up your downsizing muscles, especially with photos, sentimental items like that.
Sure, sure. Well, Gail, thank you again for being on the podcast today. I wondered to our listeners here, how can they get in contact with you, the resources that you have, the books, all kinds of things.
Well, I got a bunch of books. Good Goodbye Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die is my big one. Go to my website, agoodgoodbye.com, and you can email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gail.
Thanks.
Okay, now we get to talk about your skills as an event planner. And
Yes.
yeah, so I love
Okay, now
that part. I love
that
that.
was a little longer, but I think we're going to edit a little out. But that was
Yeah,
11 minutes and 30 seconds.
we had that time when we were just silent for a bit.
Right,
So,
right.
and I think if we get a good one for 11 minutes, I think we're okay. We just keep it around 10. Okay, so
Okay, who's going first on this one, Kim?
want to go for you want to just you want to I have the introduction here. So why don't we just keep the same formula? I'll introduce you, go first, and that gives me time to get down to the question.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today because we have Gail Ruben here again. She's been so wonderful to us. She has blessed us with all of her knowledge. She is the doyen of death. She's a speaker, a visionary, and an author, and a dear, dear, dear friend. So thank you again, Gail, for coming back today on Rethinking Death.life.
Great to
Yeah,
be with
Gail,
you.
thanks again. One of the things I know you're an event planner, and that's a lot of your background. But as an event planner, you use a lot of skills. You recommend a lot of skills that you learn to actually plan a funeral. So, can you describe some of the most important things you've learned as an event planner that applies to the funeral planning?
Sure. Funerals are the parties no one wants to plan. But but really there is many similar elements to funerals and weddings or birthday parties. I mean, you got to have a guest list. You need to have communications with your guests. You need to set a time and a place for holding the event. And you need to get food and drink and for, the reception afterwards.
Right.
And so a lot of people don't think about all of those different elements going into a funeral or memorial service. And if anybody needs the definition, a funeral has the body present, a memorial service, the body is not present.
Does that include if you're cremated? Is a funeral the cremated remains? Does that count as a funeral?
Um, It's actually technically a memorial service
Okay.
because it's the cremated remains, not the body.
I see. I didn't even know that. Thank you, Gail.
and and communication is a key part of that, because we have many different avenues to communicate about an event. Traditionally, you would put an obituary, a death notice in the newspaper. Well, now it's social media and emails and texts and all different kinds of ways. And the telephone, you can call people up on the phone.
Right, right. Gail, as you said that, there has been some definite changes and shifts in the last few decades. And, I remember when my grandfather died in the 80s. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And I remember we had to wait like 3 weeks to even get an appointment to get him in there. And back in the 80s, around that time, I don't remember I remember I was so upset because I was like, why do we have to wait 3 weeks? Because the grieving time, when I was growing up, it was a few days later, with surely within a week, that people had the funerals. So, I've observed and would love your thoughts on this of now, 30, 40 years later, we see so many memorial services that are weeks or months later than the actual death.
And I think having that memorial service sooner rather than later is better for your emotional and mental health, because if you haven't done it and you haven't gotten the word out about the death and it kind of trickles out, then you have these multiple reminders of the death. And it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear about it. I didn't know about it.
Right.
And then it's another emotional hit to your heart that, the word had not gotten out because you hadn't had a gathering as soon as you could. And there's nothing to say that you can't have multiple gatherings, have something to establish the fact that this person died and get the word out about it. And then, yeah, and in fact, yes, veteran cemetery burials, you still have delays. Here in New Mexico, where I live, the Santa Fe cemetery is where most veterans have been buried, but they're starting a new cemetery outside of Albuquerque for veterans because the one in Santa Fe is almost full.
Wow.
But you still have a several week delay scheduling with the VA to do those kind of things.
Yeah, my husband was buried in a VA cemetery, and he died during August of 2020 in the middle of COVID. We were
Oh,
lucky to we did get a funeral at our church, which was wonderful, and it was live streamed, so that was great. But it took a few weeks to get his burial, but he was cremated, so it wasn't as much of an issue. And where he's buried in the same spot as our son who passed away a few years back. And I'm hoping to get in the same spot too. I'm going to have to figure out how I do that. I think I have to be cremated and put next to him, and where they're going to fit me, and certainly where they're going to put my name around the outside. I don't know if they're going to, they have my husband's name on one side, my son's name on the other. I think maybe around the outside edge. I don't know where I go, but we were able. It's a great for those who are veterans out there. You have a great benefit and funeral. A great funeral benefit for veterans, and my husband and I are both veterans, so we were able to take advantage of that. So
thousands of dollars in savings. Yes, getting
I hope
your
my kids
burial.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. What factors should families consider when they're deciding between a living funeral, a traditional funeral, cremation, or the alternative options like a green burial, turning into a diamond, life, all those things? What should they consider? What should you consider when you're
Well, how religious is your family? Is a religious funeral something that's important? If it's a combined family with different religious traditions, those are other elements that you would want to look at incorporating. A certified funeral celebrant can help put together a meaningful memorial service or funeral that can help bring together all these various branches of the family, of which I am a certified funeral celebrant, so I know what I'm talking about.
wonderful.
And there are so many different, personalities that play into it. If that was a serious person or more of a lighthearted, joking person, there are so many different elements that would go into what kind of funeral or memorial service or disposition method that person wants to choose. Indeed, somebody who is very concerned with the environment and eco-friendliness of one's disposition, you could choose a green burial, or in 11 states at this point, natural organic reduction is an option. That's body composting. And that didn't even exist just a few years
Right.
ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm, mm. Well, Gail, how do you balance the honoring of your loved ones' wishes with the emotional and financial needs of the surviving family members?
I highly recommend pre-planning and prepaying for your funeral. Now, when in most states, when you prepay for a funeral, you're actually buying an insurance policy that pays the funeral home. If you have your own life insurance, money from that insurance policy can go toward paying for the funeral. But a lot of people don't even want to think about death, so they don't get insurance policies for their own life insurance or for pre-planning a funeral. But that is how you can ensure that your plans are put in place. And why should your loved one say, well, we don't want to do that? But it's like, well, they already paid for it, so tough.
Right, right, right.
One last time, right? From beyond the grave, right?
Right. But it, funeral directors say it's a gift you give your family, which makes me want to gag, but it is truly a gift. And uh that really takes a huge burden off of your loved one's shoulders to pre-plan and prepay ahead of time.
Thank you so much, Gail. So what are some creative or unconventional funeral ideas that you've seen bring comfort to a grieving family?
Well, I've done a number of funerals and memorial services as a celebrant. And I think one of the key things is people who are not religious. There's a beautiful reading called You Want a Physicist to Speak at Your Funeral by Aaron Freeman. He had done this on NPR's All Things Considered years ago. And it's a beautiful reading about the conservation of energy and assuring people that even though physically you're not here, your energy is still around. So that's a wonderful thing. There are so many things you can do with like a memorial table that features items that were important, things that the person made, or if they liked, hunting or fishing or whatever, bingo. They're just, just all kinds of things that you can bring in. And I did a project early on in my doyen of death career where I went to 30 funerals in 30 days and blogged
Wow.
about it. And I did this 3 years in a row.
Wow.
And so I witnessed some really incredible funerals and memorial services. I think my favorite was held in our biopark, our botanical garden here. We have a Japanese garden, and they set it up on this deck overlooking the koi pond in the Japanese garden. It was gorgeous and really a lovely
Wow.
celebration of that
Wow.
person's life.
When you talk about going to 30 funerals in 30 days, it reminds me of that movie Harold and Maude. That's all that Harold was doing, right? Was going to funerals all the time.
Goodness. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gail. How can families navigate potential conflicts when different family members have varying opinions about what type of funeral to provide?
Well, this is where like having a certified funeral celebrant can bring together the elements that are important for one person and another person and bring them all together and weave it into a cohesive event that can help smooth over those conflicts, because it can help address all of the aspects that each individual is bringing to what they want in an event.
Well, what about, Gail, the importance of involving children and younger family members in the planning or attending of the funeral? How can that help them with the grief process? I know there's varying opinions on what age some children should be. What are your thoughts?
Children should be brought to funerals or memorial services. Number one, if you think you're protecting them from grief, you're not. You're just making them wonder, what am I missing? So they need to be there. They need to be included. I mean, if it's like a 2-year-old, maybe they're not going to be at that level of understanding what's going on, and maybe you have somebody take care of the younger kids outside of the event, but they're still there at the event, and maybe let them come in at some point. It Having them kept away from a funeral does not help. It really does not help with their grief. But being able to, if it's a funeral where there's a body in a casket, sure, let them, if they want, let them go up and look at the body, touch the hand, kiss them goodbye, but don't make them. I mean, that can be
Right,
a
right.
rather
Dramatic.
traumatic experience. Yeah, if you make them kiss grandma goodbye. No, don't do that.
It's interesting you were say that because my when my husband died, he actually the day before he died, he stopped breathing and did not have a heartbeat for about 20 minutes and kind of came back and then he was very ill that day. He was pretty he was in a wheelchair, but he could talk. He was in pretty good shape beforehand, but then he really after that 30 minutes he was out. His body was not working, but he could talk. And we didn't bring the grandchildren in during that time. We knew he was close to death at that time. And I wish we had because they wanted to say goodbye to their grandpa. And we just felt they were too young to do that. And again, mistake we made, we do it differently now, but I think it's just important to really analyze that very carefully.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here. You were so informative and have such wisdom to share with all of us. As you said, we're all gonna be there at some point in time. So why not talk about it, plan it, and have those discussions as soon as we can.
And can you give us your information, especially how could we hire you as a certified celebrant?
Well, so visit my website, goodgoodbye.com. I do have a celebrant page where you can see some videos of services that I have done. In fact, I did my parents' services.
Boy.
Oh, that was a tough assignment, but we got through it pretty good. Or email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com.
Thank you so much, Gail.
Thanks. Thanks.
Well, welcome to Rethinking Death.life, and it is just my complete honor to welcome today a woman that I just have such great respect for. She's been a mentor to Kathy and I, and she is a true visionary, an author, a speaker, and she is affectionately known as a doyen of death. Welcome, Gail Ruben, to another one of our podcasts, and we're just so grateful to you for all of the information you're sharing with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kathy. Great to be with you.
Yes, Gail, we just love you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And what we want to talk a little bit about today is what are some of those post-death communication tips, pearls of wisdom, like what is the best way to communicate that your loved one has died?
I like to go old school and actually call people on the telephone to share the news, because that way you can do, immediate conversation with someone. You can let people know what the plans are in terms of a memorial service or a funeral. And then also, get feedback from the person you're sharing the news with, that, and they can be supportive. So calling on the phone, I think, is the best way right off the bat. Email, social media, uh, putting something in the newspaper, in an obituary death notice, those are
Yeah.
all ways to get the news out as well.
I know, speaking in what I've observed the last few years, even with the younger generation, um, they are totally comfortable with just texting that somebody's died. And I thought, I've been on the end of receiving that before, and I have some friends who received that their mother or father had died, and I just appreciate you saying, going back to the old pick up the phone or visit them. I know when my mom had sudden death, she did have cancer, but she was fine the day that she died. We had wonderful breakfast together, and I was gonna come back in about 20 minutes and play Scrabble with her, and all of a sudden, she just had a sudden death, and this was in the what 35 years ago or more. And so my dad had gone shopping, and there was no cell phones, as you know, back then. So there's no way to call. And so we didn't, I called the doctor. I called the funeral home. I didn't even know what funeral home, and I had her taken to a funeral home. They came and got the body. We called every mall and store and grocery store to try to find my dad and have him paged. And he came back about 2 hours later, and I'm walking out the door saying, Mom's gone. I mean, it was just, um, it, it was just very, hard on him, I know, but I felt like I needed to get out of the house and meet him at the car door and tell him before he walked in, that Mom died and she's actually gone to the funeral home already. I mean, who would think that would happen within 2 hours of you just having breakfast with your wife?
Wow. Wow. And there's also that idea about getting the body out of the house, having the funeral home come and take them away. I think in this day and age, we're maybe more inclined to take some time, sit with the body, allow people to come and visit. Um, it's death is not an emergency.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I remember when I called, we had my brother died, then my son died. We had several deaths in one year, and then a few months later, I called my nieces in Nebraska to just say I was going to come down, I was passing through, and then I called up and I said, "Hello, this is your Aunt Kim," and they said, "Oh no," and I said, "No, no, don't worry, nobody died." Nobody died because sometimes we only call people when someone dies, so it really does bring back the importance of keeping connected with people that are important to you. And I learned that
Yeah.
lesson on that one call.
Yeah. So Kim, about your son's death, because how did they call you or how was that
Oh
communicated?
boy, yeah, my son, I had this beautiful, beautiful son, Eric, who was just a very talented guy. He was at Columbia University, he was a jazz pianist. He was studying engineering. Everything was going his way. He was elected to student government, made the dean's list. He had this fabulous first semester. He came home for 2 weeks, was on top of the world. And then he went back, and about 2 weeks later, his girlfriend broke up with him, which is a normal part of life, right? That happens to all of us. But he was gone in 20 minutes. That brain that was not fully functioning, and that very impulsive jazz pianist, and he was gone in 45 minutes after the breakup. And we were in shock. When something like that happens, they tried to I was in DC. I was at a meeting in Washington, DC, and we had gone out for the evening to visit old friends, my husband and I. And they called the police to come to the hotel, the Hay Adams Hotel in DC, and we weren't there. And of course, nobody knew where we were. And finally, I got a call from a local police officer in Farmington, Minnesota. One of my patients, I was a dentist, one of my patients, and he told me, and it was I'll never forget when you're told that especially a child has died a sudden death of anyone really, but it's particularly a child. It was just like your world had exploded, and you can't even describe it in a million pieces over that time. But they tried to tell me in person, but they just couldn't find me, just kind of like your father. And the first thing he said when he got on the phone was, "Are you driving?" And I said, "No," and I wasn't driving. So, but it was just like it's something that you're gonna. It's like a piercing shriek that I'll hear the rest of my life in my ears when you hear that news. So it's a really difficult thing to pass the news on of a unexpected death like that. And I was fortunate. I didn't really, because I couldn't call anybody. I was in such shock that I had family and friends that made the calls for us, except to just a few very close family members. But it's such a hard piece of news to hear in many cases, and I think I really like Gail's recommendation to do it, either in person or on the phone if you can, to the people that are important. But I think also nowadays we do need to use social media for all the other people out there that you don't know about. And there were thousands at his funeral. There were a lot of people that showed up in New York. They did a memorial service for him in New York at Columbia, and they even put in a memorial, a shad bush down there for him. So that communication, that's why these questions were really important to me, because that communication is so important right afterwards.
And you don't know how somebody's going to react. My background is ER trauma nurse. And so I was often the one who, with the doctor, would go into the family room and tell them that their child or their husband or wife had been killed in a car accident or whatever. And I remember so many reactions. I mean, some people got angry, some people screamed and ran out, some people hit me. It's an emotional uh, thing that many people just can't even fathom, getting that call or hearing that news. So,
Well, and you need to be careful about social media announcements. I have heard families that have conflict because somebody posted on Facebook that mom or dad died. And so you need to clear with at least your siblings, hey, I would like to put the obituary on Facebook. In fact, I wound up with conflict with my in-laws, who died within a week. My mother-in-law used medical aid in dying. Her second husband died naturally, on hospice, but I put the obituary in the newspaper, and then I shared it on Facebook, and I tagged the husband's daughter and granddaughter. And oh my God, the blowback I got from them for doing that, for tagging them in this Facebook post. And the granddaughter actually got quite nasty. She was like, well, Myra did assisted suicide. And it's like, no, she was 94 years old, 95 years old, and medical aid in dying is legal in New Mexico. And it's like, so yeah, you never know what you're going to set off when you put it on social media.
And I think that putting the obituary is probably one of the most tasteful ways of doing it. Something that is alerting them very, very softly. Here's the obituary. Certainly, you're sending the message that he's gone, he or she is gone, and then they can read the details. I think that's one of the best ways, rather than watching. You have to watch your words if you make any other type of announcement.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
So. Oh yeah, you just don't know anymore, right? The world has changed for us baby boomers.
So many ways to communicate.
So Gail, what are the key elements that make for a meaningful and a memorable obituary?
Well, you want to get some colorful details about them, but you do need to also be aware that the more words you put into an obituary in the newspaper, the more it's going to cost.
right.
You can do a short notice and send people to a funeral home's website, where then you could expound at length about the colorful characteristics of your loved one. And that really, I love the fact that some obituaries go viral because they were such colorful people,
Right.
and that was captured in their obituary.
Yeah, I had one recently that went viral. I didn't even know the person, but I saved it and printed it off because this woman had written her own obituary before she died, and she was just talking like directly to you, even though you didn't know her. It's like, wow, it was incredible. Gail, what advice do you have for dealing with maybe a situation where it's a sensitive topic or potential controversial details in an obituary or exchange strange relationships, or cause
Leave
of
it
death?
out. Just leave it out. Less said, the better.
Yes. In fact, it was interesting because I had a sister-in-law who found out that her husband, the man she thought was her husband, had been married to someone else when she thought she was married to him, and she found a lot about that in the obituary. So,
Wow.
no, you can find out some things that you really don't want to know, I think. But
But
and
isn't the saying discretion is the better part of valor?
Yeah, especially in this situation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gail, for participating in this discussion today. What information can you give our viewers about how to get a hold of you and some of your services and the books that you have? I know that they would love to talk to you. Where can they go to do?
Come to my website, agoodgoodbye.com. And if you want to get in touch, email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com. And
Great. Thanks so much, Gail.
thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for an amazing topic that we're going to discuss with our dear friend, the doyen of death, Gail Ruben. Gail is an international speaker. She is an author, and she's someone that both Kathy and I admire greatly. And she's going to talk to us today about how to write a eulogy. So thank you so much for coming today, Gail. We're
You
so
bet.
grateful that you're here. Thank you so much.
Glad
Yeah,
to meet
thanks.
you. Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Gail. As we talk about eulogies today as the topic, what is the actual primary purpose of a eulogy, and how can a speaker ensure that they actually fulfilled that?
Well, a eulogy is talking about the person's life. One of the great things about funerals or memorial services is people come together from the various circles of your life. We all have multiple circles that we are involved in. And so, a good eulogy will tell that person's life story and help share information from all of these different circles of your life that bring them together. So somebody from your family might find out more about your speaking circles and friends, and vice versa. So uh, one of the key things, though, about a eulogy is you want to honor the person, not the speaker. I have unfortunately been at funerals where like a son gets up to talk about his father, but in the process winds up talking more about him and what he's doing.
Right.
And you want to avoid that.
I'm laughing because I have been there a number of times. We have a very large family, and there are a few people in it that tend to do that, and it just it's we all remember and we laugh with them actually because we realize what's happening. Sometimes they do it out of just grief and they don't know what to say, but many times it does come off like that. So that's a great
Yeah.
tip.
Yeah. And how do you, because I've witnessed this and heard other stories from some of my friends and colleagues, but how do you deal with the person who's the speaker doing the eulogy and they start talking about horrible things? I mean, it's got to happen a lot. I mean,
I don't know. I've never seen, the hook, pull them off the stage at a funeral. Um, but you want to think about structuring, and it's not just the eulogy, but the entire memorial service event has a structure that can help make it a really meaningful and memorable event. There, what I call the 4 Rs. And there's actually thanatology research that says these 4 Rs really help make for a good memorial service or eulogy. You recognize, that's the first R, we recognize that somebody has died. And in fact, when I do a funeral service or memorial service, I will actually say how the person died, uh, because, let's not dance around it. Did they live a good long life? Did they die by suicide? We need to say, yes, this person died. And very often that question will come up. How did they die? So let people know. Then we remember. So we recognize the death, we remember the person. This is when we tell stories where we, and a good tip that I've often used is think of 3 to 5 words that describe that person, and then build in a story for each of those words, those aspects of their life. Then we reaffirm beliefs. So this is a good time for the 23rd Psalm if they're religious, or if they're not religious, you want a physicist to speak at your funeral reading is a good choice. And then release. So recognize, remember, reaffirm, and release. We release the spirit of the deceased. We release the attendees to go back into their lives and to take the memory of that person with them.
And Gail, I'm so glad you mentioned to talk about how the person died, because I lost my mother and my son to suicide. And when I lost my mother back in the 70s, there was no service. No church would hold a service for her. She was a very religious woman, but in those days, that's how things were done. And it could not be more opposite for my son. We had thousands of people at his funeral at a Baptist church, including in his high school. We went to a Catholic high school. The high school kids came, even though he was no longer there. He had moved on to college, and they had buses and buses of kids coming to his funeral, including the band. And it was so wonderful that they did that. But we talked about suicide, and I remember a couple of parents coming to me, these young boys going off to school, failing at a romance and going into a depression. And I had several parents come to me that say, I'm going to get my son right now. We're going to check out. He's just broke up with his girlfriend. We're going to check out to see how things are going with him. And so I think it's very, very important, even in those, and it's one of the most difficult things to talk about is a suicide at a funeral. And but we need to do it. And I think it was very helpful. I had many people come up and thank us for making that a point in the funeral.
Nice. Yeah.
So Gail, how can you find the right balance between celebrating the deceased life and acknowledging the loss?
Well, I think when you come to that part about reaffirming beliefs, that's a good place for balancing that idea of the loss and celebrating their life. But that can be woven through the entire service. Choice of music can be very uplifting as well as meaningful. Also, doing a photo display board so you can trace, the person's life in photos is a good way to also balance celebration and recognizing the loss.
So what are some of the do's and don'ts when incorporating humor into a eulogy?
Ooh. That can be very tricky. Definitely having humor is a positive when it works. And so you want to avoid humor that's poking fun at a particular person, but maybe, more of a lighthearted remembrance of this is what so-and-so would do, that could prompt laughter, but also a sweet memory.
Right, right. I think I did my dad's eulogy, and my dad just had the greatest sense of humor. He was a practical joker. And so there was people at the funeral that had my dad's jokes played on them. So just sharing some of those stories. In fact, my dad had a big thing about dyeing mashed potatoes green on all the holidays, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas. So for the reception, we had green mashed potatoes.
That's great.
And I remember at my husband's funeral, he had some of our nieces and nephews spoke, and we had played a big part in their lives when they were young. And they talked about some of the escapades that my husband would get them into. You know, some of the things that we were able to do back in the early '70s, the '80s and '90s that would be considered inappropriate now, like letting him ride on the side of the car, the van, on the outside of the van. They'd be driving down the street on our little block and doing some of the fun things that he would let them do that you could no longer do. So that makes it even more funny now than it was at the time. So those really hit my heart, as his widow, that just remembering those fun times and the fact that he was kind of an adventurer and brought that to his rest of his family. So I think that was very helpful to me.
And one thing that as a certified funeral celebrant I do is I try to have a giveaway item for people to take or eat at the funeral. Like I did a service for a guy who loved hiking and he made his own peanut butter. So I had little packets of peanuts and gave them out to all the attendees and said, take a hike and eat the peanuts and remember so and so. I did a memorial service for a young lady who loved to bake, and so I got cookies, and it was just recently that I did this, and they had wreath cookies. So wreaths are emblematic, symbolic of eternal life and the cycle of life. So I handed out these wreath cookies to the attendees there, and they loved it. They ate them, ate them right on the spot.
Give us more.
Yeah.
I know I just went to a funeral a couple weeks ago, and they asked everybody to wear red to the funeral because that was the person that's died favorite color. So that was kind of like you were at a stadium of a football team. Everybody had red when you walked into the door. So
Yeah.
I had a friend that, dear friend of mine, who was known for her whoopie pie. She came from the Northeast, and she would bake whoopie pies for everybody, and she was just famous for that. And we had a talk. I was her cancer buddy. I would go to treatment with her, and she wanted me to hand out her recipe for whoopie pie. She Not before she died, because she was not letting anybody have that recipe before she died. But at her funeral, we got the recipe for whoopie pies with a little picture of her, working with her grandson, and that was very memorable for all of us.
That's very nice. Yeah.
yeah. Do you have any ideas on how to handle or what advice you'd give somebody who is very emotional, that's given a eulogy, that maybe start crying or unable to really speak?
I would, say take a deep breath. We're all speakers here,
Yeah,
Yeah. And, if they're really upset, ask somebody to read what you've written. I'm assuming they would have written something. And
usually,
if
yeah.
they're too emotional to deliver it, have the
Yeah.
certified funeral celebrant read it for you.
But
Right. One thing, just as a speaker, not necessarily speaking at a funeral, but if I'm on stage and I get emotional, I just take a sip of water. And that somehow helps me just ground more, and then I'm able to go on.
Well, Gail, can you tell our audience where they can get a hold of you and some of the services that you offer and your wonderful, wonderful books?
Yes, I have books. I have t-shirts with snappy sayings like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals
But
won't make you dead. Um,
I love it.
but yeah, come to my website, agoodgoodbye.com, and you can email me, Gail, Gail, at agoodgoodbye.com.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gail. Wow,
Thank you.
pleasure.
Great to be with you.